It was a dark day in US military history, captured in the movie Black Hawk Down, a combat mission to help the starving people of Somalia that went disastrously wrong. 20 years on, we ask, what lessons have been learned? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It was called Operation Restore Hope, military intervention in Somalia to safeguard humanitarian assistance and take out a notorious warlord. It culminated in the Battle of Mogadishu and a humiliating disaster for the US, captured in the award-winning Hollywood movie Black Hawk Down.
Men are surrounded by thousands of Somali militia. I need help now.
Where's the rescue squad? We're in.
These events led to the US withdrawing from Somalia, shaping that country's future and influencing US military intervention in crises around the world, as Rosalind Jordan reports now from Washington. And a warning, the story does contain some graphic images.
It started as a mission to save lives in Somalia. It ended in the worst firefight for the U.S. military since the Vietnam War. 18 troops killed, some of their bodies dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. The incident, called Black Hawk Down, has haunted U.S. military and diplomatic policy ever since.
The lesson that most people took away from the Battle of Mogadishu was that the American public was casualty averse, and that you couldn't do a military operation that resulted in dead American service members.
The troops were ambushed on October 3, 1993, while trying to capture the warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid. His fighters shot down 2 Black Hawk helicopters and captured one of the pilots. Americans were shocked. Osama bin Laden mocked U.S. soldiers, calling them paper tigers.
My fellow Americans,
President Bill Clinton called for a slow withdrawal from Somalia as a show of U.S. power. Otherwise,
and all around the world, aggressors, thugs, and terrorists will conclude that the best way to get us to change our policies is to kill our people.
Even so, Mogadishu has haunted U.S. foreign policy for years. The Clinton administration decided not to intervene in the slaughter in Rwanda in 1994. And it took officials 6 years to agree to lead the NATO air war on Kosovo in 1999. The U.S. reluctance persists 20 years on, with the Obama administration now criticized for not responding to the Syrian regime's chemical weapons attack on its citizens. The president's response:
the United States is chastised for meddling in the region, accused of having a hand in all manner of conspiracy. At the same time, the United States is blamed for failing to do enough to solve the region's problems.
So can the U.S. ever recover the will to intervene on humanitarian grounds overseas, what's now known as the responsibility to protect norm?
I think it's just more war weariness. And it's not so much related to the casualties as it is a perception that we're not very good at this, we're not getting much bang for our buck.
It's a conundrum of the first order, when the U.S. sees trying to save lives as one of its best reasons to send in the troops. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., Amira Woods, co-director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. In our London studio is Jamal Osman, an independent journalist and filmmaker specializing in Somalia. Also in Washington, we have Bronwyn Bruton, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. Welcome, all three of you. Thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. Bronwyn, how is this day and what happened during the battle that's known as Black Hawk Down being viewed in the U.S.?
Well, it came as a tremendous surprise to the American people because the United States military didn't do a great job of communicating the evolution of what had been a humanitarian effort. Very quickly, the delivery of food became tied up with an effort to arrest General Aidid. That was seen as political meddling in Somalia. But that wasn't understood in the United States. And so when Black Hawk Down took place, the American public was astonished because they just saw a group of Africans killing American soldiers for what they thought was simple delivery of relief.
How do you think the U.S. got it so wrong? Was it arrogance?
Well, it was new territory for the U.S. military, and I think it was misunderstanding more than arrogance. I do think, even today in Somalia, that when you talk to people about the operation, there was a widespread understanding that the objectives were to help. And it was perceived at the time that General Aidid was someone who was hurting the Somali population. And I don't think that people understood how anyone could object to him being arrested or killed.
Jamal, you hear so much about what happened from a U.S. perspective, but what is the perspective of that day in Somalia?
From a Somali perspective, the Black Hawk Down or the Battle of Mogadishu event was a black day. We call it a Black Sunday. And thousands, about 3,000 Somalis were reportedly killed on that particular day. And since then, the U.S. military might have withdrawn because of that humiliation and the defeat caused by the killing of American soldiers. But America never left Somalia. And there have been CIA operatives in Somalia, special forces operating. And we became the #1 enemy of the most powerful country in the world, and we were punished for that.
What do you think the lingering legacy is? You say that the U.S. has never left, but did Somalia improve in any way because of this action?
I think the U.S. contribution to Somalia has been generally negative, I would say, because immediately after the Battle of Mogadishu, America started arming rival warlords to defeat or kill General Aidid. And they were doing that for a number of years. And then later it became, after the September 11, the whole thing changed to a counterterrorism mission. So I think since 9/11, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism reports that just after 9/11, there have been special force operations in Somalia, targeted killings as far back as 2001. And when the Islamists rose up again, it increased. It funded the Ethiopian army, gave millions to kill and capture Mogadishu and kill lots of civilians.
And of course, if you train, excuse me, interrupting, if you train the warlords, as the US has done not only in Somalia but in other parts of the world, you realize how good they are. You know what sort of weapons they have. You know what it is that you're fighting against.
It is true, but when they were arming and funding the warlords, it prolonged the civil war, because these warlord clan militias were killing Somali civilians, fighting against each other. So it caused civilian death, it caused death and destruction in Somalia, in particular in southern Somalia, I would say. So yes, the US might thought they were doing something good by arming warlords who were criminals, but as far as the Somalis are concerned, that wasn't a good mission and a good policy, and a lot of Somalis feel because of what happened in Battle of Mogadishu, we are punished for that.
Amira, what are your thoughts on the Battle of Mogadishu 20 years ago and the legacy of that?
Well, I think we first have to pull back the lens of history and understand that really U.S. engagement in Somalia started on a disastrous footing way back in the Cold War, when both the U.S. and the USSR essentially dumped weapons into Somalia, making it essentially ungovernable. And I think what you had was a steady increase in a very militaristic response to an effort to really control Somalia, because of its strategic location. Remember, just off the coast of Somalia are the ships that flow from the Middle East to U.S. and Europe and elsewhere. It is that geostrategic location of Somalia that has brought it of increasing significance historically. But it's also the resources on the land. It's oil, particularly in the northern parts of the country. Other key resources, including potentially uranium on the shores of Somalia. So I think it is the interests in Somalia that have brought U.S. military action throughout really decades. And I think we have to also underscore that in spite of Black Hawk Down, the U.S. has, as my colleague in London quite rightly said, continued its engagement militarily through U.S. private military contractors, through the proxies, first the Ethiopian ground forces and then the Kenyan ground forces engaging in Somalia. So the U.S. has been quite active. More recently, it's been the drone assaults, with U.S. drones, aerial attacks, essentially, in Somalia, harming not only targeted individuals, but also innocent civilians. So I think there has been, in spite of Black Hawk Down, a real effort to control the destiny of Somalia by the U.S. and other external actors for far too long, when the Somalis are actually clamoring to have opportunities to choose freely their own leaders, to hold those leaders accountable, to have the resources meet the needs and interests of the people, not the external forces.
And Jamal, it's interesting now that the focus, if it ever went away, is back on Somalia because of what happened in Kenya and the siege at the mall there and what is seen as the rise of Al-Shabaab who were involved in that siege.
Yes, we are back on the news, sadly. And I think, again, the Americans, I travel to Mogadishu quite a lot, and especially in what they call the green zone or the airport, and where the government controls, you see lots of American, what they call special advisors, if you like. So, and there is a CIA-run prison in Somalia, in Mogadishu, and they have presence in other parts of Somalia, like Puntland and Somaliland. So they are very active in Somalia. I'm sure they have a long-term strategic, as my colleague mentioned, of potential oil and mineral and everything else. But I think a lot of Somalis feel that the attitude towards the Somalis, it's from the Americans, it hasn't been good, and they could use their power and money to change people's lives in Somalia, as well as might be long-term aim of getting oil and everything else they want. But generally, their contribution and what the Americans are doing in Somalia, I would say, is a disaster.
Now, the US is accused of operating a network of bases, training programs and so-called advisory deployments across Africa. It's a claim flatly denied by US Africa Command. According to them, the US operates out of one single military base in Africa, Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, but reports suggest US troops are stationed in some capacity in bases across Africa. A so-called cooperative security location in Entebbe in Uganda is said to be home to US drone operations. And a station in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou, also reportedly a hub for surveillance planes, as well as elite forces capable of carrying out high-risk activity. So, Bronwyn, a great and growing presence for US forces, but a much lower profile.
That's true. And, in response to some of the comments that have been said, though, I certainly agree that U.S. activities in Somalia have not been constructive. I would point out that rather than think about Somalia as enemy number one for the United States, if you look at the nature of U.S. activities there, which has involved deploying African troops and using for-profit security firms as opposed to American soldiers, what we see is that Somalia is actually quite peripheral to U.S. interests. There was a long period at the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s where the United States was really not worried about Somalia at all and was doing very, very little in the country. And one of the main reasons that U.S. actions in Somalia have often seemed so destructive is that the U.S. has paid very little attention to the country. And that's why, as in the Black Hawk Down incident, what American soldiers do actually is misinterpreted so often because they haven't taken the time to learn or to understand the culture, and that's a sign of indifference rather than focus.
Okay, you say that possibly it has dealt with the Somali intervention in a way that it shouldn't have, but if we can talk about the other bases across Africa, why is it that the US says it only has one when in actual fact there is a growing presence on the ground in Africa?
There's a growing presence of military advisors who have the goal of working with African militaries to train them so that they can do the work that America doesn't want to do. It's the same sort of dynamic that I was talking about in Somalia. If Africa were truly a military focus of the United States, American troops would be on the ground in large numbers. And instead, what President Obama has described is what he calls a light footprint approach, which is a deliberate strategy to minimize the number of American troops that are in Africa. Because frankly, America wants to limit the amount of money that it has to spend in Africa in a time of economic crisis. The reality is economics, unfortunately, not military ambitions.
Amira, do you think it's an economic policy, or the fact that after Somalia, after Black Hawk Down, the way the military operated had to change? People wanted something different. They didn't want to see soldiers being pulled down the streets, and therefore drones are just a whole lot more effective.
Well, I think part of it is cost, it's seen as less expensive, but it's also, political will. The American people are not interested in, fighting massive wars, particularly in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think we have to underscore that the U.S. military presence is off balance still. It is the military that has the resources, not the development arm of the foreign policy toolkit, not the diplomacy even arm of the foreign policy toolkit. It is the defense that ends up being highly resourced and having really great political leverage. That's been the case from the Bush administration and now still through the Obama administration. So it is often, military officers that are in embassies making decisions that often ambassadors would have historically made. So I think we have to underscore the need to shift the balance. If the U.S. is interested, as it quite frankly is, in accessing oil and other vital resources from Africa, does it continue to have an increase in its military engagement in, again, from places like Libya all the way through to Mali to Somalia? Does it continue this overemphasis on what some of us call an overemphasis on the still global war on terror and counterterrorism in a short-term role, or is there a long-term engagement through economic development, through opportunities through which
that seems to be
people,
China's role more than the US,
country,
isn't it? And isn't that why the US is there? To fight not only Al-Qaeda, but to take on China?
Accessing resources and countering China. That ends up being still the dominant frame for the U.S., along with this fight for terrorism.
Jamal, why do you think countries would open up to the US? Because often when it's known that US forces are there, there is some kind of knock-on effect, the Al-Shabaab effect.
It is true, and I traveled through Djibouti a number of times, and when you are at Djibouti airport, you can clearly see American fighter jets landing and taking off every few minutes. So they have a huge presence in there, and I think the American presence, military presence, I would say, is increasing across Africa. And probably the long term is resources and power and controlling the Africans. And if you look at the country like Djibouti, the leader is a dictator, literally. So they are dealing with dictators. But I'm sure if you have democratically elected
But that's an important
leaders,
part of the continent, isn't it, Djibouti, if you think of what happens and the sort of arms that go through that area?
It is true. So the Americans are generally dealing with dictators who they put in power and support and fund. But if you have an elected African leaders, they would probably not allow the American military to have presence and control over their sources, if you like. So I think that this has been a long sort of American policy, and I'm sure they will continue doing so.
Now, military intervention is generally seen as a last resort to resolve conflicts and prevent humanitarian disasters around the world. Such action can be justified under what's called a responsibility to protect, a set of principles adopted by the United Nations in 2005. They determine that a state has a responsibility to protect its population from mass atrocities such as genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. The international community has a responsibility to help states fulfill this responsibility. It should also use appropriate diplomatic and peaceful means to protect populations, but be prepared to take stronger measures, including the collective use of force through the UN Security Council. Bronwyn, critics often question the motives of any intervention and who really benefits at the end of the day, even if you put it under the label of humanitarian.
Well, some of the strongest criticism against R2P, the responsibility to protect, has actually come from the African Union, which has taken a line frequently that it prefers to protect the autonomy of countries. At the end of the day, to be frank, I think private security contractors benefit most from interventions of the kind that have been conducted in Africa. Increasingly, you're seeing the outsourcing of activities to firms that are operating for profit. I would have to say, though, that the United States often resists intervention of that kind. It was heavily criticized for not intervening in Rwanda. It was criticized for not doing enough in Darfur. It was criticized for not doing enough in Congo. So I don't believe that the United States feels that it benefits from these interventions in any way except on moral grounds.
Okay, Jamal, I mean, you wonder if a country can be an honest broker in any way if they do intervene.
I think you can be an honest broker if you intervene, and I think it's the motivation. Why are you interfering in the first place? I think that's, and people are quite suspicious about the Americans and why they interfere in certain places and not the other places. But I think in the case of Somalia, initially it was a humanitarian mission, and then straight away they went into politics and meddled in Somali politics. So I think if you can avoid the politics, which is a very difficult thing to do, then I think you can achieve that humanitarian intervention, if you like, and bring positive results.
Amira, if you look at the military intervention 20 years ago, what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, the US military in all this time, it's just not particularly good at it, is it?
Well, without a doubt, you know, it is very difficult to go in and assume that you understand the history, the culture, the dynamics politically within a country, and to be able to control the destiny of peoples throughout the world. You know, it comes from even teenagers. They say, oh, just let me choose my own destiny. That, you know, people around the world are clamoring to have that right, that human right, basic human right, to be able to freely choose their destiny, choose their leaders, and then hold those leaders accountable and not have those decisions done based on short-term interests, often economic interests, in accessing resources on the land. And so I think fundamentally, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, Somalia, or Libya, you know, people are determined to be able to place their destiny in their own hands and to not have, whether it's multinational corporations or private military contractors or Western governments dictating their future for them.
Bronwyn, and the US is in a difficult position here, isn't it? I mean, hate it if they get involved, hate it if they don't.
Very much so. I respect Ms. Woods' point regarding the need for people to choose their own destinies, but in Somalia, for example, there was just a famine that the United Nations says killed over 200,000 people. And I think it's very hard for countries that are wealthy, like the United States, to sit on the sidelines when those kind of events are occurring. The U.S. did intervene in the famine in Somalia in the 90s for humanitarian reasons, and although it meddled in politics, it attacked General Aidid because General Aidid was diverting humanitarian resources, not because the United States really cared very much about the organization of Somali politics at that point.
Okay, Jamal wanted to say something. What was that, Jamal?
No, Yeah, I was going to say, I think in the case of Somalia, Turkish could be a very good example of, they have been in Somalia for only 2 years since the famine. And you can clearly see they are building hospitals, schools, roads. That's what people care about. And Americans always say we are spending millions on Somalia, but where is that money going to? So that's the big question, I think. The Americans say we are helping people, but who are they helping?
Well, let's leave it on that note. Thank you so much to my guests, Amira Woods, Jamal Osman and Bronwyn Bruton. A reminder, you can find this programme, many more, at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And why not like us too? I'm Jane Dutton. Bye-bye.